Good afternoon and welcome to the BC Tourism and Hospitality webinar with an industry update. I see that we still have quite a number of people that are just being let in from the waiting room. So we'll just allow another minute or two while people continue to sign on. And then we'll start in a matter of a few minutes. I'm Ingrid Jarrett, President and CEO of the BC Hotel Association. And I'm joined today by my dear colleague and friend, Walt Judas, the CEO of the Tourism Industry Association of BC. Again, for those of you that have just joined, we'll just give another moment or two. I see we have quite a few people that are just being let in from the waiting room. And so we'll start in a matter of a few moments. Thank you.
Hi, Ingrid. Hi, Walt.
Hello.
Good to see you guys again.
And you too, Vlad.
Hi, Vlad.
Looking forward to the update.
Yeah, one of these days we're going to have an update and we're going to have a news story to tell.
Let's hope so. Hi,
that's why we're calling it an update.
Yes. Let's hope it will be in person on a golf course. How about that? That'll be lovely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Soon.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ingrid Jarrett, and I'm here with Walt Judas. I see we have people continuing to just sign in here. We'll just give another moment or two, and then I'll just give an overview of sort of the housekeeping.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Okay, citing that we're sitting at 1:03 and respecting everybody's time during this incredibly busy and challenging time that we're living in. I'll just say that this recording is being recorded. And I will ask all the participants, please, to mute yourselves and just stay on mute until we have our question and answer at the end of the webinar. We have allocated time in order for you to ask questions. So both Walt and myself will present a state of the industry and some information we hope will be helpful. And then should you have any questions, please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen. And we will have somebody managing your questions, and Walt and I will do our absolute best to answer any questions that you have. As a follow-up to that, in both of our communiques, we also will reach out with any answers that we were unable to get to in case we have many questions today. So again, thank you very much. I'd just like to acknowledge that we have a sponsor for our webinar today, which is the Integra Services Group. And the Integra provides specialized programs for industries on surface protection, building maintenance, custodial caretaking services, outsourced staff janitorial supplies, and best-in-class cleaning services. I'd like to acknowledge and thank them very much for being a sponsor for today's webinar. We also would like to acknowledge and thank our growing membership and for your support over the last year. As an industry association, we're completely dependent on membership, and we currently have been able to work hand in hand with industry during these very trying times so that we are not an organization that puts additional financial pressure on you as our members. And we continue to do absolutely our best to make sure that we're advocating and doing everything to support you at that time. So I'd just like to acknowledge our two newest members. Chris, if you could just go back, John Henry's Marina and Resort and Salt Spring Island Coffee. Welcome. And Walt?
And these are two of our newest members. Ingrid, thank you. BlackRock Oceanfront Resort and Canadian Staycations. And we thank them for supporting the work that we're doing.
So if we were to say one statement that describes where we are right now, it definitely is that our businesses were the first hit by the pandemic, the hardest hit by the closures, and no doubt will be the last to recover. With extended support, we can thrive and survive. And believe me, Walt and I on a daily basis are working on those two things. Without it, Canada's tourism, culture, and hospitality industries will be devastated for a generation. It's a very dire time indeed. This is myself, Ingrid Jarrett, President and CEO of the BC Hotel Association. I'm thrilled today to be joined by Walt Judas, CEO of TIABC. Walt and I held an industry update webinar last fall. Many of you may have joined us for that. We got such a resounding positive response, we determined that it was time to do another one given the ever-changing landscape. So thank you so much for joining us today. Walt, over to you.
Thank you, Ingrid. And in fact, we did a webinar this morning with Tourism Vancouver, and some of you may have participated in that. And we're going to cover some familiar ground to be sure, but hopefully provide a little bit more information than you even heard this morning. So I always appreciate the opportunity to present with Ingrid. In fact, somebody said to us yesterday, you guys are joined at the hip, and I really feel like we have been over the course of the last 13 months or so. Of course, we joined conferences this year, which was a big success, but we're working very diligently on a daily basis on the advocacy front. And it means that we intersect all throughout every day, along with some of the other sectors that we work most closely with. I will start by saying I am speaking to you today from the territory of the Katzie, Kwantlen, and Semiahmoo First Nations, and I thank them for their hospitality. So perhaps you've seen this, Tell Us Your Story, on our website, in our bulletin, in Ingrid's newsletter, and other places that have distributed this information. What we've tried to do is collect stories from different businesses throughout the province to get a sense from individual operators, business owners, what they're experiencing. So you can see here what we've asked for, talking about primary customers, tourism, supply chain, etc. And what we aim to do with this information is present it to government, either in the form of a whole stack of these stories that we can talk about and present to them on what is really happening in our industry, or we can use some of these stories in the context of media relations, but it's all done for advocacy purposes. And I wanted to start off with this because I wanted to share a story with you that is indicative of the kind of feedback that we're getting or what we're hearing from people around the province. And this is from an operator in the north. She says, my primary customers are from the US going to Alaska. My revenues from camping were down 80% from pre-COVID. I'm totally tapped out resource-wise. I've taken advantage of the wage subsidy and CEBA funds. I also received a loan from RRF. I have now had to start using some of the RRF funds. Everything else has been used. The problem is that it'll have to be paid back, and I'm still paying a mortgage on the campground, so I'm extremely worried about the future. There's a restaurant on site here. It's shut down again, so the expenses keep adding up. I'm trying desperately to keep my main employees working, but with this last shutdown, I had to lay off all but one employee. My husband and I don't take a wage, so we've been doing as much as possible ourselves. Our customers support all the local businesses, from grocery stores to gas stations to the local museum. Having no tourists affects this small community immensely. It also affects our suppliers for the restaurant. Government decisions are absolutely killing us, especially keeping the border closed. I have the same small group of local customers all the time at the restaurant. We have no active cases in the small community. We're all getting vaccinated at a quicker rate because we're a remote community, but we're still getting penalized. We've been declining for years as a community. This has taken away another avenue for small businesses to survive. My employees are so uncertain whether they have a job day to day. I have employees with children and I have employees who are single moms. Now, when I hear these kinds of stories, and I know Ingrid receives these all the time as well, it makes us double down on our advocacy efforts because these are really heartbreaking situations. And there are countless of stories like this from across the province. And it's really what we're endeavoring to do is allow decision makers to understand at the ground level what's happening in communities within tourism and hospitality around the province. Next slide, please. So normally TIABC would be focused on these priorities, and I'm not going to spend any time on them, but certainly these are all important issues for our industry. Things like climate change, what's happening in marine tourism with the fishing file and with whales, the transportation side, emergency management, supporting Ingrid and the work that she's doing with online travel agencies, and fairness and taxation and so on. But clearly the last 13 months, we focused pretty much exclusively on COVID-19 priorities. And so here you see a list of some of the things that we've been working on for many, many months now. Sometimes the order of these change depending on what's happening with government, impending government decisions, things like the budgets that were announced last week at both the federal and provincial level. But by and large, this is what keeps us tethered to our desks all day, every day, and speaking to various levels of government about, and the odd time we have new issues that come up, and I'll speak to most of these as we go through this afternoon and try and stick to time. Next slide. So everybody is aware now of the travel restrictions that were put into place, and Ingrid's going to talk a bit about this in her presentation as well, but I wanted to provide you with some context because I really think that we gained some ground in the work that we've been doing with government and in building relationships. And when I say that, it's because we got a heads up that these travel restrictions were going to be implemented a week before the decision was actually taken, notwithstanding the Premier alluded to it in a news conference at the start of last week. But nonetheless, the Minister Mark, reached out to us a week ago or a week and a half ago and said, help me help you. In other words, the province is going to go forward, but how can we work with the tourism industry and the hospitality industry to not only mitigate the impacts and be part of the messaging, but what is it that you can do as a sector to support this action? Now, granted, from our perspective, there were a lot of caveats. We had to push back a little, and that's perhaps a strong word, but we did suggest to government, look, we will help. We want to be part of the solution. We have the capability. The minister asked the four of us that you see here, including Ingrid and myself, to come up with a plan. What is it that you can help government with? But conversely, when I say we pushed back a little, it was not so much a push, but more recommendations on what we felt industry needed in order to really wholeheartedly support this plan for the greater good, being the health and safety of people, the health and protection of the healthcare system, and obviously to try to save our summer for the tourism and hospitality sector. So we came up with a plan. It took us about 72 hours to complete it. We submitted it to government a week ago Sunday. Next slide, please. But we asked for a few things that government could work with us on that would really help our industry embrace what was being proposed, particularly because we recognize there would be a lot of hardship for businesses around the province. So firstly, and some of this hasn't necessarily been clear in previous messaging, certainly in the directives that have previously been instituted or the orders, but clearly define the meaning of local. And I think the Solicitor General did a good job of that. The Premier, Dr. Henry have all done a good job of defining local, as have we as industry now supporting this. One of the things we asked for, though, is listen, let's really be specific and say it's only a 25-kilometer radius from where you live. Government wasn't quite willing to go there at this stage simply because there are some things included in non-essential travel that, as far as government is concerned, are still necessary, like buying groceries. And if you live in a rural community, sometimes you've got to go 50 or 80 kilometers for supplies. So they didn't feel that this was necessary. Nonetheless, they were very clear to suggest, look, if you live in Chilliwack, don't travel to Vancouver. If you live in Penticton, don't go to Kelowna. Those types of things are still very strong words, but that's not necessarily officially part of the order. We also asked government to clearly define what constitutes essential versus non-essential travel, and you will see a laundry list of those that we've all published, and Ingrid will talk about in just a couple of minutes. We asked government that if we're going to effectively shut down for all intents and purposes, and we know that's not fully the case, sort of a hybrid version, but if we're going to do that, we need access to additional financial relief, similar to the circuit breaker package for bars and restaurants, and Ingrid will also mention this in the context of hotels, but we're still talking to government about those sectors that haven't been a part of circuit breaker and need to be, or what needs to change within the criteria of circuit breaker to allow more businesses to qualify. We asked government to clearly state the health needs and expectations of a timeline for lifting of the restrictions. And in my conversation with Premier Horgan last week and Ingrid's conversation with the Premier today, he clearly intimated there is a full intention of a sunset clause on the restriction on May 24th. In other words, starting on the 25th, those restrictions will be lifted because the province suggests that you'll see the vaccination rates go up and the transmission rates go down. And there is a tipping point that they believe will take about 4 or 5 weeks before we'll begin to be able to travel again, certainly broader within our regions and hopefully between regions again too. We asked for sufficient resources to enforce the new order. It's not us as industry trying to enforce it, but the responsibility has to be placed on those authorities. Next slide. We also asked that government consider entities like BC Ferries and BC Parks in particular, which they've done. They've reached out to both BC Ferries and BC Parks, who have both implemented specific measures about either canceling or validating why people are traveling, etc. Certainly there are some restrictions on recreational vehicles. There are a number of things that they've both done in the process. But we also ask government, look, if fixed roof accommodation, commercial accommodation is going to comply in one way, shape, or form with these orders, then it also has to apply to things like Airbnbs and VRBO and private rentals, because the last thing we want is communities filling up with leisure travelers and they're staying at short-term vacation rentals, and they seem to be getting away with it, and yet they can't do so at a hotel. So government has reached out and is working with those entities to ensure that happens. Similarly, they are talking with municipalities, law enforcement, etc., on how to enforce the order, as well as to monitor things like when we go to a park and we see dozens and dozens of people gathered together or playing sports well beyond what the current order calls for. They need to be complicit in part of this solution as well. Next slide. So these are some other things that we're still talking to government about, creating a reopening plan, and I'll reference that in just a few moments. It must be made clear that it's not BC's tourism and hospitality industry that is the cause of transmission. Certainly people traveling between communities might be considered part of the reason, but it's really what they do when they arrive. They're not obeying the rules. They're not social distancing. They're not taking the same precautions that you and I might. So don't demonize the tourism and hospitality sector, but talk to people about their individual behavior. We've also asked that as we come out of the travel restrictions, that the Premier and Dr. Henry actively reference in messaging, it's safe to travel again. Please consider yourself a tourist in British Columbia and enjoy all that we have to offer. So by the time we got through all of the work and had been working on a toolkit and key messaging, Minister Mark rallied together, a number of leaders from different sectors and DMOs and a number that you see here of folks that included both Ingrid and myself to run through the messaging and the Q&As in preparation for the news conference last Friday. I think she got a lot of valuable feedback. Next slide, please. Dr. Henry was also on the call, and these are some of the things that she said to this group. But I can tell you, in as much as the province chose to go the order or the direction of an order, many in our industry said, why not just completely shut down for a 2-week period? Close it all off to everyone, not only in the travel and tourism context, but other sectors as well. We think that that might be necessary. As I say, the province really believed with the data that they were looking at and the tipping point, as I alluded to earlier, they didn't need to do that. But Dr. Henry did say, if it makes it easier, I'm willing to put in an order if that's necessary. So we have heard her loud and clear, and hopefully we don't have to get to that point, but she certainly conceded that it was important. Here's a copy of the official order. We'll move on to the next slide in the interest of time. We know that a lot of this is necessary because people still aren't comfortable with people visiting their communities. So local residents don't want people from nearby communities, or at least a lot of them don't, certainly not from other parts of the province. This is an obstacle that we'll need to overcome when the time comes where the travel restrictions are lifted and we see people traveling again. Let's go on to the next slide, please. So very briefly, you know, the provincial budget was announced last week as well. There are measures Ingrid will talk about that pertain to tourism and hospitality. We know there is still 1.1 billion in unallocated funds to help for health scenarios or situations like this where the tourism and hospitality sector is affected. So we'll be petitioning to the province and appealing to them that these are funds that we need allocation for tourism and hospitality, or we need the province to come to the table for, if only because many operators have not received anything of any measure, federally or provincially. Next slide. One of the things that we did submit to the province, just a very brief update on, is this tourism recovery investment program, both to the federal government and the provincial government. The province, we've had ongoing meetings. Ingrid, Brenda Baptiste, and I submitted this document that was crafted by PwC. And now we're at the point where we've surveyed, I think we sent the survey to 78 large operators, hotels, resorts, transportation companies, attractions, and we got 50 responses. So a healthy response. We'll learn the outcome of those responses today. But I do know that roughly 60% of the respondents are not able to meet their obligations, their fixed cost obligations. Their debt servicing ratio is completely out of whack after this last year of virtually no business. Next slide. These are some other measures that we're still, again, advocating for that are so important to many other sectors across the entire visitor economy. I look at things like crown fees and lease payments that are so vital for those in the adventure tourism sector. Ingrid, I know, has been very diligent on the property tax relief that is so necessary for her members, and there are many others here to be sure. Next slide. So just a quick update on BC meetings and events restart. Most of you may be aware that we submitted a restart plan a couple of months ago. There was a work group, an advisory committee. Both Ingrid and I have been a part of that process, led by Joanne Burns-Miller. And it was sent to government, to the PHO under Section 43 of the Public Health Act. We know there is going to be demand for meetings and events, and you can see some of the stats here as it relates to the States. Canadians aren't quite ready yet to see those venues open. But if you go to the next slide, please. One of the things that we did as a follow-up, because we haven't had a formal reply from the PHO yet, is sent a letter this past week to say, we'd love the minister, that is Minister Mark, to be a champion on our behalf, certainly working within the health and safety protocols and all the reasons why a graduated opening of meetings and events could happen. But here's what Alberta's doing, just as an example, and what their chief medical health officer sent to industry very recently. They are looking at removal of capacity restrictions in late July. So at least it's a marker there. It doesn't necessarily mean they'll get there, but they put the markers down with a process or a plan to get toward achieving those things. Very quickly, Go2HR has undertaken an absolutely necessary project, and they've partnered with a number of folks, but they've gotten support from the provincial government. There is an advisory committee that Ingrid and I are a part of, and many others likely participating in this call, but they are doing an exceptional job of capturing the type of information that is going to be vital for our sector once things return to so-called normal. And I'm cautious with that statement. Prior to COVID, there was a huge labor shortage in our industry. We've lost a lot of people in the industry now because of COVID. But when businesses return and start to reach capacity again, we're going to need access to skilled labor, and we're going to need access to workers all across the province. So this research project is very ambitious, but as I say, going to be vital, and you can see what it's designed to do. But really, now with the sector engagement already underway, there have been a series of meetings to ask these questions. How should the tourism and hospitality industry and associated workforce be defined? What regions, or how should the regions be defined within BC? And it's likely not going to be a tourism region, but an economic region. What issues need to be addressed? What would be most useful? And how do we move forward in developing a labor strategy to ensure our industry is looked after? Next slide. So these are the folks that have been part of meetings already, with many more to come. And GoTo has submitted a series of milestones already to the province with the objective to have this more or less ready by sometime in the fall. Next slide. A couple of other issues that I'll quickly mention before turning it over to Ingrid. We know that this was an issue last year when guests have put down payments on experiences, and those are a range of experience around the province that weren't able to be fulfilled, largely because borders were closed and not necessarily because businesses were shut down. They demanded a refund, or at least were entitled to one. And you can see here the obligations of the business, and certainly the rights of a consumer who wants a refund. Now, many businesses, to be fair, converted those bookings into further bookings, or deferred them, I should say, to this year. However, with borders continuing to be closed and no sight line for when they will reopen, we don't know whether we'll be, as an industry, able to fulfill a lot of these trips. And so therefore, this issue has come to the fore again because those that deferred, those guests are asking for their money back. Go to the next slide, please. This is something that we've been speaking to government about both last year, and we've reintroduced it again this year, that within Consumer Protection BC, or the legislation, let's extend the date of refund from the time of cancellation. So it's no longer 30 days. Allow an extended period. Maybe it's a year, maybe it's 2. Allow the supplier to offer a voucher or credit. And some guests are choosing to accept that, but they're not necessarily obligated. And then importantly, suspending enforcement of any penalties or enforcement of the legislation, just given that we're in the middle of a pandemic and there's not much we can do. And a lot of these businesses have already spent those funds on operating costs and don't really have access to more capital to be able to provide those refunds. A couple of things as I wrap up here. We are speaking to the province about a tourism relaunch plan with some clear milestones. In fact, Ingrid and I, on behalf of a larger coalition of businesses and associations, sent a letter to Premier Horgan earlier in the month talking about working closely and collaboratively with government, with Ministers Mark and Kalon and other ministries, including health, on a specific tourism restart plan. We talked about creating a tailored plan that includes a balanced, risk-based approach and creates a roadmap for government and the sector. We talked about a plan that will lessen the uncertainty associated with sudden shifts, developing clear and specific milestones, and a communications plan as well. Now, I will tell you, the province, this is part of the discussion that's underway now within government, but will also include related sectors. So it's not germane only to tourism, but it's the arts and culture sector, more on the film side, sport, festivals and events. There's a whole bunch that, for the most part, have been shut down. Not film, but many of the others really haven't had the opportunity to operate over the past year. So they'll all be included in that discussion, and there will be some meetings forthcoming in the not too distant future. So I think I've got 2 more slides here. Everybody asks us about rapid testing. We get this all the time, and we've asked government conversely, at the federal level and provincial level, will rapid testing be used as a means to accelerate the process for border mobility or getting people to travel again? I can tell you that there isn't a great big appetite to do it in the travel context necessarily, although there could be some segments within travel, i.e. to reduce the quarantine period for when people travel here on board an airline. But you can see here some results that are very favorable to antigen rapid testing that could be deployed within a work context. So really allowing employers to use rapid testing to be able to test employees to determine whether they are fit to come into work. There's lots more information that will be shared on rapid testing, I think, in the coming weeks, but it's not necessarily in the context of travel and tourism. And then finally, we get a lot of questions as well. What about this notion of a vaccine passport? And some people equate that to having proof of vaccine within your passport, but that's not really what we're talking about. It's really proof of vaccination in the form of a digital health card, or maybe it's actually a physical card of some kind that many countries will deploy and begin to use to welcome people back into their countries. And you can see some that are issuing those cards for citizens, but many more countries, and we're suggesting, listen, let's open it up to visitors, particularly those who have been vaccinated, if they can show proof of vaccination. And those discussions, while we haven't seen the criteria or don't understand yet what government is considering, those discussions are underway. So I'll leave it there. I don't think there's anything more other than perhaps leaving with a bit more positive news. And that is to say, when I read these stats that 89% of people miss eating in restaurants, most of us miss visiting friends and visiting family. We miss traveling in Canada. We miss even going to our favorite vacation spot outside of Canada. And we miss those activities that we've always enjoyed. When the travel restrictions are lifted and when we see more travel. Hopefully later in the year, we can look forward to enjoying these things again. And so with that, I turn it over to my valued colleague and friend, Ingrid Jarrett.
Thank you, Walt. I actually miss networking at conferences. You know, there's so many relationships and so much business is done on the floor of a reception or during the breaks at conferences and events for industry. And I have a sight line on when we can once again do that again. So I have a few topics here on behalf of the industry. So just a state of the industry, some advocacy priorities, some roll up your sleeves work that we're doing with insurance strategies, and then a little more in detail on the travel restrictions, the circuit breaker, and then the BSAFE program, which we're thrilled that our partners with GoToHR are rolling out. So state of the industry right now, 47% of our industry is not eligible and does not qualify for the SME grant. We have worked with government to look at specific restrictions and how our industry is eliminated. We are also hearing loud and clear that the timeline between application and actually any processing information or confirmation is anywhere from 4 weeks to 8 weeks, which is unreasonable given the dire straits of the industry. 75% of our accommodators are operating at reduced capacity. Keeping in mind, we have accommodators all over the province. So hotels, resorts, backcountry lodges, heliski operations that have been closed for over a year. And any businesses currently that are closed is not included in that number. So it's even more dire. We did a forecasted occupancy between January and September by month. The average anticipated occupancy, because of the lack of goalposts and the lack of specifics in how to reopen and when, 38% is the anticipated occupancy, which is just heartbreaking. So number one piece of advocacy that we heard loud and clear and continue to hear is the extension of the CEWS program. I'm very pleased to say my partners at the Hotel Association of Canada, TIAC, and ourselves, along with Walt, were successful in having the announcement that it's at least till September. We'll continue to ensure that our message is heard. Our goal is that it's till the end of December and that it is rated based on revenue loss comparatively to 2019, and also as the hardest hit sector, that if we're the only sector that can continue to access it, then we're going to make sure that we're successful there. You know, when you look at the liquidity numbers right in the beginning, I just honestly, that's what keeps me up at night. And it's directly tied to the access for the different relief measures and the restrictions around that. We need to be whole in order to recover. And that is a very clear message that we send when we're talking to government. And the 60% have lost more than 1 million. I'll tell you 40% have lost more than 5 million. Keeping in mind 82% of the accommodation sector in the province is small and medium-sized businesses. That is a really critical stat. 40% of our industry says if they can't access those relief financing pieces, either by loan or by grant, that they will not survive and will permanently close. So a landscape for Hotel Association of Canada, and I do represent British Columbia on that board and ensure that all of you as industry are connected to those advocacy efforts. They've done an amazing job. The amount of tourism support and the partnership between TIAC and the Hotel Association of Canada is extraordinary. Within the 1.5 billion with tourism relief fund that was announced was a big win for us. Also the 1.4 billion for supporting businesses. I can tell you that the HASCAP raising the ceiling and eligibility for foreign ownership and also multiple property ownership continues to be on our plate federally. The big win for us was that there will be a digital tax on short-term rentals. This was along with the previous announcement about GST and HST also being attached to Airbnb VRBO and the other short-term rental market, our position has always been, let's have fair rules for our industry. If you're looking at a hotel sector that has to pay business insurance, business taxes, business property taxes, and contribute to MRDT and all of the other fixed costs, then every other sector within the accommodation portfolio should be the same. We've identified nationally as well the need to work on labor, and I'm really encouraged by the work that we're able to do with Go2HR to quantify the need of our industry ahead of when we're looking to reopen. The other ones are the rehiring, the wage subsidy, which I referred to earlier, and then the fixed costs, which is the SIRS program being extended. And then of course, we're working very closely with air travel when it's time to travel internationally. The profile for the BC budget highlights really as it applies to tourism as well. We have the 195 million to continue the small and medium-sized business grant. Of course, this is not new money. 100 million to support tourism recovery with major attractions. We have not seen the detail of that announcement. It was just announced on Monday. I'm working hard to ensure that that includes both tourism and hospitality. I don't know where that's going to go, but that certainly is my goal. Also 20 million for community destination development, 83 million over 3 years for operating capital funding for parks, and then 6 million to capital improvement grants for the arts infrastructure program. Now, Walt just detailed to you what the last 2 weeks of our lives have been. This has been a really big piece of work, very heavy lifting, lots of negotiation. And we really did our best to ensure that what is the number one thing we need to do is we need to stop this pandemic in its tracks. We need to have a summer, at least BC, if not domestic, and we need a plan to reopen so that we can look to the future and understand how we can reopen the travel economy. So again, you know, we looked at it and we met with our boards and we sought industry and we came up with the best middle ground that we could between shut down entirely, which is what every single operator told us, to no, they didn't want to shut down, they wanted to control travel, and then negotiated to ensure that they understood that there was a partnership approach to the messaging and the communications around that. I just want to acknowledge, I keenly understand the hardship of losing revenue, like what happened on Monday with an errant announcement that none of us knew was going to happen and what the content of that announcement was. And by the time the order came out on Friday, I understand that 5 days completely devastated some parts of our industry. At the end of the day, we have to have our sightline on the 25th of May, and we need to make sure that we're understanding as the vaccinations go up and as the COVID cases come down and hospital stays come down, it means that British Columbia residents are safe to reopen. And there is nothing more important than getting back to business and starting to have our sector get back to business again. So this was just detailed. These are some of the quotes that were in the joint release from Minister Mark and ourselves, really making sure that we're acknowledged for the safety and the amazing job when it comes to operating over this year, providing safe shelter and community continuity and all the work that we've done over the year, and we'll continue to work on some of those positive joint messages. And then here is some key messages around travel, our travel restrictions. It is evident that travel is not dangerous. What is dangerous is the human behavior that individuals choose that actually puts other people at risk. And it has been very important for us that we pivot from this conversation of travel shaming to an important role that we can play and the safety when restrictions are lifted to once again travel again. Those kind of communications are going to be critical for us to grow consumer sentiment. Here's a map of the revised health regions, citing the importance to understand. The key here is the Lower Mainland and the Fraser Valley. So the two coastal health authorities, Coastal and Fraser Health, really the goal here is to ensure that they're kept within those two boundaries. Vancouver Island is kept to Vancouver Island and the rest of the province. This does not mean, I wonder how far I can travel now that I'm in the interior. It doesn't mean I can go and see the dinosaur footprints in northern BC. It means stay local until the 25th of May. Within these health regions, travel for essential travel only, and we can actually have a shot here at reopening. Next slide, please, Carissa. Here is some excerpts. We did do a joint statement with Minister Mark, and this is also included in our toolkit. We're very encouraged that they're acknowledging the industry for the leadership role that we're playing. And here is the partners that got together to develop those key messages and supported the development of the toolkit. Couldn't have done it without this, we could not have done it without this team. And I can tell you, we rolled up our sleeves and we put on our reading glasses. We didn't sleep very much. So here we are. Very, very important stand that we took for the industry is that businesses are not expected to enforce restrictions. I'll tell you, I've been roasted and tied and thrown out to the wolves about 15 times in the last week about this stance, but it's the right stance. We have frontline workers, just like restaurants have frontline workers, that cannot for a moment be expected to be the police in this circumstance. What we can do, though, is to play a pivotal and a leadership role to educate the public, all get behind the self-responsibility, doing the right thing for all of our best interests. And those are the position statements that we've been able to provide within the toolkit as well. Next slide, please. So the recommendations, here is social media and some of our hashtags, our key messages and the links to those key messages, the DBC social media and the toolkit, the know before you go content that you can use for your own marketing and your own websites. And included in that is the map of the regions and the zones and the actual detailed essential travel reasons. One of the most important things we did was encourage definition of essential travel. You know, on November the 8th, when the recommended non-essential travel be curbed, there was so many questions about what is essential travel. So we've been able to really get a detailed list. At the end of the day, it's for work, it's for health, for doctor's appointments, and really that's the core, but also for a funeral or, you know, there's other things that are included now in that list to make sure that there's clear understanding. Enforcement is the responsibility of the provincial government. It is not the responsibility of our industry nor our employees. Next slide, please. So I now have some questions and answers from the toolkit. This is directly from the toolkit. So I'm not going to go through the whole thing, citing the importance that we only have 10 more minutes. And I know that Q&A is really important on these webinars. So within the toolkit, which Carissa, if you can pop the link to the toolkit in the chat, then everybody on the webinar can have it if you don't already have it. We're asking you to take the scripts that we provided, put it in your emails, put it on your website, use it for social media. So all of us together are educating the traveling public. Next slide, please. Circuit breaker announcement, I did refer to that earlier. 25 million has been extended to the accommodation sector, the workability of that, and the how is that going to work? We all know it's nowhere near enough, but we have been added to that program. The insurance industry, of course, in 2020 was a complete disaster. It was the last thing we ever expected. Enormous insurance rates, hardening of the market. We have a pooled insurance program for our sector and for the food and beverage sector. We are working across Canada with the Canadian Hotel and Lodging Association and the Insurance Corporation of Canada, looking at the landscape, recommendations on how we can mitigate that actually happening again in 2021 until the market once again softens. At the end of the day, there's 3 underwriters in the world and there's no competition. And that's really what's going on right now. Now, our partners with GoToHR very quickly have developed their task force recommendations on BSAFE to support consumer confidence, training our teams, looking to recovery, and looking for labor resiliency. So this program right now is being developed. Next slide, please. BSAFE. And the course content will include all of these different pieces, and then will be rolled out at the end mid-May 2021 to pre-register for employees. It's now open, so sign up today on the GoToHR website. Help spread the word. We'll have a media launch for National Travel and Tourism Week. And BSAFE really is a program to ensure that we're gaining trust and that we can really promote and ensure consumer confidence when they come back to British Columbia. Next slide, please. And now we can go to Q&A. I hope I didn't race through that too quickly.
Ingrid, I did want to acknowledge that Teresa Watt joined us. She's the official opposition critic for tourism. So thank you, Teresa, for your advocacy work on our behalf. I'm not sure if there are any other government officials that have joined us today, but if you have, please, by all means, direct message us so we can acknowledge your presence. I noted too a couple of questions that came up as you were speaking, Ingrid, and great information, excellent information on the advocacy work that BCHA is doing. But there was a comment about the earlier slide referencing our recommendation to put in a 25-kilometer radius for non-essential travel, which government did not adopt. And I just want to emphasize again, they chose not to go that route because, for obvious reasons, there are supplies that people need to pick up that are 50 or 100 kilometers away when you're in rural British Columbia. So they have no interest in going there, hence the reason they created the boundaries that they did. There was another question about staycations, and is a staycation okay? And why staycations, and what does that actually mean? I'm paraphrasing the question, Ingrid, but you might want to tackle that one.
Sure, you bet. And this was one of the things that our joint release from government included. So a staycation is when somebody within your own community chooses to stay in a resort or a hotel or a motel or whatever the configuration might be to support the local economy. This period of time between now and the 25th of May, it's critical that we shop local, we buy local, we support local. And we've been able to see the pivot that the restaurant industry has been able to do, although this does not mean they're not still experiencing extreme hardship. But with locals supporting restaurants and with locals supporting and staying in hotels, it still keeps that travel local. And that is exactly what the PHO and the government is looking to do. So it's a way for you to support your local industry.
There was also a reference to the announcements that took place last week, 3 different announcements relating to the impending travel order. And again, I'm paraphrasing, I don't have the question in front of me, but it could have been clearer because I think, as you acknowledged too at the start of your presentation, Ingrid, all of the different information that was coming out throughout the week caused a different reaction within our industry. Some right away started canceling their reservations from a consumer perspective, but also from a business perspective. Others played the wait and see until the official order on the Friday. But I think between when the Premier first alluded to this happening, he may have been a couple of steps ahead of where the official order was at that time, but at least it was some advance notice. And we had the opportunity to work during that week and negotiate with government on what that order would look like or what the implications were to try to mitigate potentially some of the damage that it could cause to our sector. So you heard dribs and drabs, and I think part of that too is the media actually feeding on what they heard the Premier say and trying to generate some of the stories which were not necessarily entirely accurate and certainly the order had changed by the time Friday rolled around. So some of that required clarification. But as I stated right off the hop, this is where I think as we're building the relationship with government and working with them now well in advance of an order, we can try to clarify some of that before misinformation is presented through whatever means. And it wasn't necessarily the intent, but that's how it rolled out. And fortunately, I think we were on the right track by the time Friday rolled around, and the information that you saw presented today on the toolkit, et cetera, is the culmination of lots of hard work, as Ingrid alluded to, over the course of about a week to 10 days.
I see another question here, Walt, around the foreign ownership restriction for relief. And thank you, Reid, for that question. This is a file I will not give up on, and I did have a call with the Premier today and brought it up directly with him. You know, there's two things we can do here, and we're doing them both at the same time. One is to ensure that any federal relief does not have this restriction. And the other one that we need to do is continue to implore and to provide an understanding of the contribution of these businesses that have invested in British Columbia over many, many years. We have, I mean, I'm so disappointed in that complete fence around accessibility when there is so much contribution from these industries with ownership outside of British Columbia. And this would be the same for somebody from Alberta or a Canadian person, as well as a US or a foreign ownership. So Reid, at this point, I can tell you that we continue to advocate for that limitation to be removed, and we'll continue to do so. We haven't been able to move it yet, but my intention is that we will. And I see another one about Alberta. You know, I've said this in many media interviews over the last week, and I know Walt has as well. Alberta is our best neighbor. It's our only land neighbor other than our neighbor to the north. And when we look at the relationship and the importance of Alberta to our travel economy, as most of us know, it is significant. So as soon as an Albertan or somebody comes into British Columbia, this order applies to them as well. Many people live here and work there. Many people work in Alberta and no, vice versa, BC and Alberta. So we really need to continue to ensure that restrictions within BC are upheld when they're in British Columbia, but that we also make sure that we hold that relationship precious, because it's not just tourism, it's with the wine industry, it's boating, it's so many different industries that are interdependent on our neighbors, both to the north and the east.
And to pick up on Ingrid's comment, whether in media or directly to government, we talk all the time about the importance of the Alberta market to the province, to suggest that, look, you know, there were pockets and sectors of the visitor economy that performed reasonably well for a few months last year, and we're actually performing reasonably well again this year. And a lot of that is fueled by the Alberta market, because they have second homes in the Kootenays, or that's their playground, is the Kootenays, as well as the Okanagan. So I think the province does understand how important the Alberta market is, but it is something, again, that we'll continue to emphasize, particularly in the context of travel restrictions, or as we get back to marketing efforts and opening up to domestic visitation. We'll impress that upon decision makers, to be sure.
Now I'm seeing that it's 1:59, and respecting everybody's time, I don't know if we have one more.
There was a question on the cost of BSAFE. Here that
I think you're on the line, and I don't want to answer on your behalf. If you could unmute yourself and just speak to the cost of BSAFE.
Yes, thanks very much, Ingrid, and thanks very much for the question. And so right now, we are working very, very hard to make the training program as accessible across the board to all BC tourism hospitality businesses as possible, because we realize and recognize the tremendous financial strain. So cost to be determined, but it's going to be very, very accessible if we can make it happen the way that we need to.
So that means Krista's working really hard on dollars. And we're sure that she's going to get them, because if our whole industry was BSAFE, which other jurisdictions are doing all over the world, it puts us in a place of confidence, even though I know we're already confidently doing an amazing job with our health and safety protocols and practices. So I just want to say thank you to everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're thrilled that you took the time and spent it with us for the last hour. Both Walt and I are very accessible. Reach out anytime. We're here to support you and our industry. And believe me, we're completely committed to getting the other side of this pandemic on our feet. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, and continue to tell us your story. Please send us the information that we need to do our work. Thanks again.